The winds of change had not yet swept across the green hills of England. Before the dream of empire, before the thunder of cannons across distant seas, England was a land of feudal lords, knights in chainmail, and peasants bound to the soil. Castles crowned the rolling countryside, their banners fluttering in the wind as shepherds tended their flocks. London was still a medieval city, its timbered houses leaning over narrow cobblestone streets, its skyline marked by the spires of St. Paul's and Westminster. This was an island kingdom at peace, yet beneath the quiet, ambition brewed, an ambition that would one day stretch across oceans and redraw the map of the world. The 16th century brought the rise of a queen whose presence would define an era, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Draped in gold, her gown shimmering like the sun itself, she held in her hand a globe, a symbol of her kingdom's growing reach. Under her reign, England's seafarers became the sharp edge of ambition. Sir Francis Drake and his galleons clashed with the mighty Spanish Armada in storm-lashed seas, their cannons thundering into the wind. Flames danced across the water as enemy ships burned, and in the aftermath, the English Navy emerged victorious. Across the Atlantic, hardy settlers stepped onto the shores of the New World, planting the seeds of England's first overseas colonies. The age of exploration had begun, and the empire's heartbeat quickened. From the harbors of London, wooden leviathans of trade set sail under the banner of the East India Company. Their prows sliced through the waters toward India, the Spice Islands, and beyond. The empire's lifeblood began to flow in spices, silk, sugar, and human misery. Caribbean plantations thrived under the whip, their fields worked by enslaved Africans under the watchful eyes of armed overseers. The docks of London overflowed with exotic goods, crates of tea, barrels of rum, bolts of silk, as fortunes were made and empires built on the backs of the oppressed. The Union Jack began to flutter over far-flung forts and castles, claiming not just land but the destiny of millions. By the 18th century, Britain and France were locked in a deadly embrace for global dominance. Across oceans, their navies clashed, towering ships of the line trading broadsides amid clouds of powder smoke. The sound of cannon fire rolled across the waves as sailors scrambled in the chaos, their decks slick with seawater and blood. Maps of the world were redrawn with every victory and loss, territories changing hands like prizes in a deadly game. In London and Calcutta, ports thrived with the spoils of conquest, while colonial governors, clad in silks and gold, ruled over subjects with an iron gaze. This was the empire at war, its fate balanced on the tide. But empires are not built without enemies, and sometimes those enemies are former subjects. In the American colonies, anger festered under the weight of taxes and imperial control. The redcoats marched in tight formation, their muskets cracking under a smoky sky, but the revolutionaries charged with fierce defiance. Battlefields blazed with the clash of ideals, and the air reeked of gunpowder and resolve. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed by powdered diplomats, their pens sealing the loss of Britain's jewel across the Atlantic. The Union Jack was lowered, and for the first time, the empire bled. In the steaming heat of Bengal, monsoon clouds gathered as two armies faced each other across the sodden earth. The British East India Company's forces, disciplined and deadly, clashed with the army of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. The field thundered with musket fire and the roar of cannons. Betrayal sealed the Nawab's fate, and by the battle's end, Bengal was under British control. Calcutta's skyline began to change, its Mughal domes joined by the spires and colonnades of colonial architecture. Behind the glitter of new palaces lay villages stripped bare, famine stalking the land even as British coffers overflowed. The dawn of the 19th century brought with it a storm that would sweep across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions threatened to dominate the continent. Britain stood as the last unconquered island, defiant against the French Emperor's iron will. On the seas, Admiral Nelson led the Royal Navy to unmatched glory at Trafalgar, where the thunder of broadsides echoed like the heartbeat of a nation. Sailors clung to rigging as cannonballs tore through masts, the decks slick with seawater and blood. On land, British soldiers marched through the smoke and mud of Spain in the Peninsular War, their bayonets flashing in the sun as they pushed back Napoleon's legions. Waterloo would come, a day of mud, rain, and history, where Britain and her allies finally shattered the Emperor's dream. These wars forged Britain's military identity, proving it could not be bent or broken by the greatest of enemies. While Europe burned with war, a different revolution roared to life in Britain's heartland. The Industrial Revolution transformed the empire from a land of fields to a kingdom of factories. Iron skeletons of bridges spanned rivers, steam engines hissed and roared, and cities swelled with workers. Coal smoke stained the skies, and the sound of spinning wheels and hammering steel became the new war drums of empire. This mechanical power gave Britain the tools to dominate the seas, to fuel her armies, and to manufacture goods that would flood markets across the globe. Yet behind the glory lay the misery of the working poor. Children bent over looms, miners crawling through darkness, and disease festering in crowded slums. The empire's strength grew, but so did its shadow. By the late 19th century, Africa became the next canvas for imperial ambition. In Berlin, European powers carved the continent into spheres of influence with the stroke of a pen, but on the ground, it was a storm of conquest. British forces in khaki marched across deserts and jungles, their Maxim guns spitting death into warriors armed with spears and rifles. The Union Jack rose over Cape Town, Cairo, and countless forts in between. Gold, diamonds, and ivory flowed north while resistance was crushed with brutal efficiency. The empire painted swaths of Africa red on the map, but beneath the color was the grief of peoples torn from their land, cultures suppressed and generations shackled to foreign rule. In 1879, the quiet hills of southern Africa erupted in blood and fire. The Zulu kingdom, proud and unyielding, met the full force of the British Empire at Isandlwana and won. British lines broke under the Zulu Impi's relentless assault, spears piercing through the ranks, redcoats falling one after another. Yet the empire's vengeance was swift. At Rorke's Drift, a handful of soldiers held off thousands through a night of fire and steel, their rifles blazing until dawn. The Zulu resistance was crushed, but the war became legend, a testament to both the courage of a native kingdom and the relentless will of an empire unwilling to yield. Far from Africa, Britain's gaze fixed on China, a vast empire rich in silk, porcelain, and tea. But trade was unequal, and Britain sought a weapon to tip the balance: opium. When the Qing dynasty resisted, Britain sent gunboats. The Opium Wars were not wars of honor but of greed, fought to force a nation to its knees in the name of profit. Cannons shattered Chinese forts, Royal Marines marched through smoke-choked streets, and treaties were signed at gunpoint. Hong Kong was seized, ports were pried open, and a proud civilization was left humiliated. This was empire at its most ruthless, dressed in the language of commerce, but written in blood. India was the jewel in Britain's crown, and the jewel rebelled. In 1857, the sepoys, Indian soldiers in the East India Company's army, rose against their masters. The rebellion swept across the plains like wildfire. Kanpur, Lucknow, Delhi, names that would be etched in history with fire and blood. British garrisons were besieged, civilians caught in the crossfire, and massacres staining both sides. The empire responded with ferocity. Villages burned, rebels executed en masse, and cities brought under brutal martial law. The East India Company was dissolved, and India came under direct crown rule. It was both a turning point and a warning. The empire could be shaken, but never without a terrible price. The sun blazed mercilessly over the deserts of Sudan, where the empire sought to tighten its grip on the Nile. In 1884, General Charles Gordon stood behind the battered walls of Khartoum, defiant against the forces of the Mahdi, a messianic leader whose warriors swept across the sands like a living tide. The siege dragged on for months, the city starving as the Nile ran red with blood. When the walls finally fell, Gordon met his end in the palace he refused to abandon. The British response was swift and vengeful. Kitchener's army marching through the desert with Maxim guns and artillery, annihilating the modest army at Omdurman in a storm of machine gun fire. It was a brutal reminder that the empire would bleed to hold its dominion. In the rocky hills of South Africa, a different kind of war tested the empire. A war not against native kingdoms, but against European settlers. The Boers, Dutch-descended farmers, fought with guerrilla cunning, striking at British supply lines and vanishing into the veldt. The empire responded with overwhelming force. Scorched earth policies, the destruction of farms, and the internment of civilians in concentration camps where disease claimed thousands. The war was bitter, slow, and costly, but in the end, the Union Jack flew over the gold and diamond fields of the Transvaal, and Britain's power in southern Africa was cemented. The dawn of the 20th century saw Britain ruling over a quarter of the world's land and population. From Canada's icy coasts to Australia's sun-baked deserts, from India's crowded streets to Africa's vast savannas, the empire's reach seemed unshakable. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, its dreadnoughts gleaming in the sun, their guns casting shadows of deterrence across every ocean. In London, the world's wealth flowed like a river: spices, silks, gold, rubber. Yet in the colonies, the cost was paid in sweat and blood. This was the era of Pax Britannica, an uneasy peace enforced not by diplomacy, but by the certainty of British steel. 1914 shattered the illusion of peace. Britain's empire marched to war alongside millions from its colonies: Indians, Australians, Canadians, Africans, all answering the call to defend the motherland. The Western Front became a graveyard of mud, barbed wire, and broken bodies. At Gallipoli, Anzac troops stormed beaches under a rain of bullets. In East Africa, British and colonial soldiers stalked through jungles in a forgotten campaign. The war drained the empire's strength, even in victory. The red of the map was stained darker by the blood of its subjects, and the seeds of discontent were sown deep in colonial hearts. While Britain fought to hold its empire abroad, rebellion brewed close to home. In Ireland, centuries of tension erupted into the War of Independence. Guerrilla fighters of the IRA struck at British patrols and garrisons, melting away into the countryside. The Black and Tans, feared for their brutality, responded with fire and reprisals. Villages burned, civilians suffered, and in 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty split the island, birthing the Irish Free State while the North remained under the Crown. It was a fracture that would echo through the century. The years between the world wars saw the empire's grandeur maintained, but only just. Economic depression gnawed at Britain's strength, and nationalist movements stirred in India, Egypt, and beyond. Mahatma Gandhi's salt marches defied British law without a single shot fired, shaking the moral foundations of empire. In Palestine, tensions between Jewish immigrants and Arab residents tested Britain's control. In Africa, educated elites began to question the permanence of colonial rule. The empire still looked mighty on the map, but in truth, the tide was beginning to turn. 1939, the empire faced its greatest trial. Nazi Germany swept across Europe, and Britain stood alone, shielded only by the RAF's courage in the skies over the Battle of Britain. From Africa to Burma, from the deserts of El Alamein to the jungles of Kohima, imperial forces fought desperately against Axis powers. The Japanese advance in Asia shattered the myth of British invincibility, as Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fell in days. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. The empire was exhausted, its coffers empty, its colonies restless. The Second World War had saved Britain, but doomed its empire. In 1947, the jewel in the crown slipped away. After decades of struggle, both peaceful and violent, India won its independence. But freedom came with the tragedy of partition. Millions uprooted, trains filled with refugees, and rivers running red with communal bloodshed. For Britain, it was the end of an era. For India and Pakistan, the beginning of new, turbulent destinies. The empire's heart had been cut out, and the red on the map began to fade. The 1950s and 60s swept across Africa like a tide no empire could hold back. From the Gold Coast to Kenya, nationalist leaders stepped forward. Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and many others, rallying millions to demand self-rule. Britain's withdrawal was sometimes peaceful, as flags were lowered and new nations were born. But in places like Kenya's Mau Mau uprising, independence was won in fire and blood. Guerrilla fighters struck from the forests, while British troops retaliated with mass detentions and brutal counterinsurgency. In the end, the empire's African territories slipped away one by one, the Union Jack coming down to the sound of drums, speeches, and the cries of freedom. In 1956, the illusion of Britain's global power shattered under the desert sun of Egypt. When President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military operation to retake it. Bombers roared over the canal, paratroopers descended from the skies, and tanks rolled through the sands. But the United States and the Soviet Union forced Britain to retreat. The world saw the truth. The empire no longer ruled the waves, and its fate was now tied to the will of greater powers. The Suez Crisis was not just a political defeat, it was a public funeral for Britain's imperial confidence. Even as it retreated from Africa, Britain fought bitterly to hold Malaya, a land of rubber and tin vital to its economy. Communist guerrillas waged a shadow war from the jungles, ambushing patrols, sabotaging railways, and disappearing into the green abyss. British and Commonwealth forces adapted, deploying jungle trackers, conducting airstrikes, and resettling entire villages to cut off the rebels' support. The war dragged on for over a decade, a reminder that even in its twilight, the empire could still bare its teeth. In the Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus became another flashpoint. Greek Cypriot nationalists seeking union with Greece clashed with British security forces in a deadly insurgency. The narrow streets of Nicosia echoed with gunfire, and ambushes struck without warning. British soldiers patrolled behind sandbag checkpoints while political negotiations tried to outpace the violence. The struggle ended with independence in 1960, but British bases remained, a reminder that even in retreat, the empire kept one hand on its former holdings. On the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, the port of Aden burned in the 1960s. Arab nationalist fighters attacked British troops in alleyway ambushes and roadside bombings. The city's markets and mosques became battlegrounds, and the British responded with armored patrols and night raids. But the cost in blood and resources grew too high. In 1967, Britain pulled out, leaving behind a land that would spiral into decades of instability. The retreat from Aden was another chapter in the slow dismantling of the empire's Middle Eastern presence. By the 1980s, the empire had all but vanished, but one last flash of imperial defiance would come in the cold waters of the South Atlantic. When Argentina seized the Falkland Islands, Britain launched a naval task force across 8,000 miles of ocean. Harriers screamed through low clouds, Exocet missiles tore into warships, and soldiers fought brutal battles across frozen, wind-swept hills. Victory was swift, but it was not a return to empire, only a reminder that Britain, though diminished, could still fight fiercely for what remained. In 1997, the last jewel of Britain's Asian holdings slipped away. Hong Kong, a city of glittering skyscrapers and teeming streets, was returned to China after 156 years of colonial rule. The ceremony was solemn, the Union Jack slowly lowered in the night rain as Chinese flags rose. For many, it was the symbolic end of the British Empire, the final bow of a global power whose rule had once spanned continents. Though the empire was gone, its shadow lingered in the Commonwealth, a family of nations bound not by force, but by history. Former colonies, now independent, gathered under the British monarch's symbolic leadership. Sports, trade, and shared institutions linked them together, even as memories of colonial rule stirred complex emotions. It was not the empire, but it was its legacy, transformed into something softer, less domineering, yet still marked by its past. In the 21st century, the British Empire lives on in memory and in debate. Statues of imperial heroes stand in some places, topple in others. Museums display treasures taken from across the world, while nations call for their return. Some remember the railways, the trade, the shared language. Others recall the chains, the famines, the massacres. The empire's history is written in both pride and pain, and Britain itself grapples with how to tell its own story. The sun has long since set on the British Empire, from the castles of medieval England to the global network of colonies, from naval supremacy to post-imperial reflection. Britain's journey is one of ambition, conquest, triumph, and loss. Today, it stands not as a ruler of the world, but as a nation shaped by its imperial past, its culture, politics, and identity forever marked by centuries of empire. And though the red has faded from the map, the echoes of that vast dominion still roll across history like distant thunder.